She lost her son and was on the verge of the end until a restaurant completely changed her life. The sun had barely risen on the horizon, but Maria was already up, preparing for another long day at the restaurant. At 55, exhaustion already weighed on her body, but the strength that moved her came from a deep place. She needed to keep going, not for herself, but for Henrique. He, her youngest son, was no longer the promising man he had once been. He had lost everything since the death of his wife, sinking deeper into alcoholism and despair. Maria spent 16 hours a day in the restaurant, dealing with the heat from the stove, constant customer orders, and heavy pots that had already worn on her joints. Despite all this effort, the salary barely covered the bills. Besides rent and food, a considerable part of the money ended up in Henrique's hands, who wasted it in dirty bars around the city. Maria knew what he was doing but preferred to turn a blind eye to this truth. The hope that one day he might change kept her going. At the end of another exhausting day, Maria walked home, her slow steps carrying not only the weight of work, but of a life dedicated to others. The small apartment where they lived was modest, with old furniture and walls stained by time. As she opened the door, the familiar smell of alcohol hit her immediately. Henrique was sprawled on the sofa, with a half-empty bottle of cachaça beside him. "Mom, can you bring more money tomorrow?" he muttered, not even lifting his head. Maria sighed, feeling the lump in her throat tighten. He didn't even ask how she was or how her day had been. His eyes, once full of life, were now empty, lost. And despite the pain of seeing her son in that condition, she couldn't say no. "Henrique, you need to stop this," she whispered, her voice thick with sadness and exhaustion. "It's killing me to see you like this." Henrique, irritated, got up abruptly. The glass that was beside him tipped over, spilling the remaining drink on the floor. "I didn't ask you to worry about me. If you don't want to help, then don't," he shouted, his words filled with contempt and bitterness. Maria felt a solitary tear run down her face, but she dared not confront him. She just lowered her head and went to get a cloth to clean up the mess. This wasn't the first time it had happened. It had become a constant in her life, working tirelessly and, upon returning home, dealing with Henrique's fits of rage and despair. She went to bed, her body aching and her mind restless. Sleep, as always, was slow to come. Maria thought about the past, the choices she had made, and the times when Henrique was just a smiling child full of dreams. Where had everything gone wrong? The next day, the routine repeated itself. Maria got up early, dragging herself to work, where she spent another shift in the heat of the kitchen. The restaurant's movement was constant, and even though she was tired, she prepared each dish with the same dedication as always. But in her mind, thoughts of Henrique never left her in peace. At night, when she returned home, Maria found the apartment empty. Henrique wasn't there. The silence enveloped her in an uncomfortable way. Maybe he was at some bar, she thought. Maybe he would come back even later, drunk as always. And he did return, but that night something different happened. Around 2 a.m, Maria was awakened by a loud knock on the door. Frightened, she ran to answer, imagining it was Henrique, needing help to climb up to the apartment. But what she found was much worse. A policeman with a serious and heavy look. "Are you Maria?" he asked. Maria could barely stammer a yes before he continued. "I'm sorry, your son Henrique was hit while crossing an avenue. He was intoxicated." The ground seemed to vanish beneath her feet. The world spun around Maria, and a silent scream exploded in her throat. The tears she had been holding back for months finally fell, flooding her face. All the sacrifice, all the effort to try to save him, now seemed to have been in vain. Time seemed suspended as the policeman's words echoed in Maria's mind. Henrique was hit. He was intoxicated. That couldn't be true. She could barely process the information, as if her body and mind were in separate places, unable to come together in the face of the overwhelming pain that began to form. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Her body trembled, her legs weak, and for a moment she thought she would collapse right there at the door of the small apartment. The policeman, noticing her fragility, lightly touched her arm, offering discreet support. "Ma'am, do you need help? Do you want someone to stay with you?" he asked, his voice calm but distant. Maria slowly shook her head, still unable to make a sound. Her thoughts raced, but at the same time, everything was incredibly slow. Henrique's death seemed impossible to comprehend. She had always known her son was adrift, but she had never imagined such a brutal end. Not like this. Not so soon. Hours passed in a blur. Maria was taken to identify Enrique's body. He lay there, motionless, pale, so different from the boy she had carried in her arms, nursed, raised, and loved with so much care. His face, even marked by alcohol and exhaustion, still bore traces of the son she had always wanted to save, but never could reach. Back in her empty apartment, Maria felt an overwhelming silence. Memories invaded her mind with suffocating intensity. Enrique, still young, running through the house, laughing, full of life. The first time he talked about his love for Helena, the young woman who had enchanted him and who one day would become his wife. And then, the memory of loss. The day Enrique cried for the first time since childhood, when Helena left and never returned. Her death was the breaking point that he could never overcome. Maria found herself trapped in that cycle of memories and pain. She sat at the kitchen table, the place where she used to prepare meals for Enrique, hoping that a good meal could at least bring him some comfort. Now, the table seemed enormous, empty, and cold. She rested her head in her hands, unsure of what to do with the emptiness consuming her from within. Physical exhaustion mingled with emotional fatigue. In the days that followed, the weight of Enrique's absence became unbearable. The apartment, which once seemed too small for the two of them, now felt immense in its solitude. Every corner held a memory, the smell of alcohol that used to linger in the air, Enrique's clothes thrown around, the old bottle he left on the floor. All of it tormented her, but at the same time, they were the only remnants of him that remained. Maria's grief wasn't just the pain of loss, but also guilt. She felt as if she had failed. As a mother, she should have done more. Maybe she should have screamed more, insisted more, fought harder to pull him out of the abyss he had plunged into after Helena's death. Now, there was nothing left to do. What remained was the bitter realization that despite all her efforts, she hadn't been able to save her son. The days dragged on slowly. The work at the restaurant, which once served as a silent escape from her problems, now seemed impossible to endure. Every dish she prepared, every order that left the kitchen, felt like invisible weights pressing down even more on her already tired shoulders. The hands that once worked with dexterity and speed now trembled, and the mistakes, once rare, began to pile up. One of those nights, upon returning home, Maria looked at the chair where Enrique used to sit. She found herself staring at the emptiness, as if still expecting him to walk through the door, stumbling over his own feet, as he had done so many times. But now, that chair would remain empty forever. The weight of that reality crushed what little strength she had left. In the days that followed, Maria lost the will to continue. The restaurant, which had always been her refuge, now seemed like a strange place. The silence of her home, once broken by Enrique's outbursts and desperate pleas, became deafening, and in the midst of that emptiness, she began to question her own purpose. After all, who was she living for now? And so Maria stayed there, sitting at the table, staring at nothing, trying to find some answer that would free her from the guilt and sadness that were now her only companions. The days following Enrique's death turned into a dense fog. where Maria wandered like a shadow of herself. The restaurant, which had once been her lifeline, now felt like an unbearable burden. Every pan, every dish seemed heavier than her fragile body could bear. The smell of food, which had always brought comfort, now seemed to suffocate her, reminding her of everything she had lost. Her co-workers noticed the changes in Maria. Her hands, once precise and agile, now trembled as she held the knives and utensils. Mistakes, once so rare, became frequent. Salt was added in excess, pasta was overcooked, and orders were delayed. The restaurant owner, a patient man, began to lose his calm. He tried to be understanding, but the impact on the business was undeniable. "Maria, you need to rest. Go home, take a few days off," he suggested, in a tone that mixed kindness and concern. Maria just shook her head, unable to respond. Going home meant facing the emptiness. She preferred the exhaustion of work to the sepulchral silence that awaited her in the apartment. The restaurant was all she had left, even if now it was a place of agony. Days turned into weeks, and the pressure on Maria only increased. One afternoon, while preparing a meal for an important customer, she let a sauce burn that she had been making for years. When the smoke rose and the bitter smell filled the kitchen, her co-workers watched in silence. It was an unacceptable mistake, and Maria knew it. Her eyes filled with tears, but she couldn't apologize. She felt like she was falling apart. At the end of the shift, sitting on the edge of her bed, Maria looked around the small apartment. Every corner reminded her of Henrique. Every detail brought back the pain of his absence. There was a box of belongings that the hospital had given her, the clothes he was wearing at the time of the accident, the empty wallet, a worn keychain he never replaced. She had never had the courage to open the box. She just kept it there as a painful reminder of what could no longer be changed. The sleepless nights began to accumulate. Sleep was always interrupted by nightmares, where she saw Enrique crossing the street repeatedly, only to be hit by that car again. Maria would wake up sweaty, breathless, and the cycle of pain would start all over again. There was no rest, no relief. One Sunday, when the restaurant was exceptionally busy, Maria, already at the limit of her physical and emotional endurance, dropped a pan full of hot oil. The liquid spilled onto the floor, nearly hitting a co-worker. The noise was loud, and the customers in the dining area heard the commotion. Her boss, alarmed, rushed to the kitchen, his eyes wide with surprise and frustration. "Maria, what's going on with you?" he asked with a mixture of anger and concern. "I've tried to be patient, but you're putting everyone at risk. I'm sorry, but maybe it's best if you take some time off." Those words, though spoken carefully, hit Maria like a blow. Take time off? The restaurant was the only thing keeping her going. Without it, what would be left? What else could she do? Yet she knew she couldn't continue. Her mind was so full of pain that the details of the kitchen, which had once come instinctively, now seemed blurred, distant. I understand," Maria replied, her voice weak and faltering. When she got home that night for the first time in years, Maria didn't feel the physical exhaustion from work, but the deep weariness of the soul. She sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes fixed on the window. Outside, the world continued its course, indifferent to her pain. People came and went, cars passed by, life went on. But inside that small apartment, time seemed to have stopped. With the restaurant out of her hands, what awaited her was an even greater emptiness. The days dragged on, one after another, and the loneliness became increasingly oppressive. Maria wandered around the house, lost in her own memories and regrets. She looked at old photos where Henrique and Pedro, still children, smiled carefree. Where were those days? How had everything turned into a nightmare? A month passed, and Maria was on the verge of collapse. The few hours of sleep she managed were haunted by fragmented and confusing dreams. Mornings were worse when she woke up and realized once again that Enrique was no longer there. Her mind could no longer cope with the weight of so much suffering. It was on one of those days, while she was staring at the phone without knowing why, that it rang. The unexpected sound echoed through the quiet house, breaking the heavy silence that surrounded her. Maria answered without thinking, and on the other end of the line, a voice she hadn't heard in a long time echoed. "Mom, it's me, Pedro. I heard about what happened to Enrique. I'm coming home." Those words, simple but full of emotion, made Maria feel a small spark of something she didn't know still existed: hope. Pedro's words echoed in Maria's mind like a distant echo, as if they were hard to believe. It had been so long since they had really talked. Pedro, her eldest son, had taken a different path, going abroad in search of success in a promising career. The conversations between them had become sporadic, limited to short calls on holidays and quick messages on birthdays. But now, after the tragedy with Enrique, Pedro had resumed communication, as if his brother's death had broken a silence that had lasted for years. Maria held the phone with trembling hands, unable to find the right words. "Mom, are you there?" Pedro's worried voice sounded on the other end of the line. Yes, I'm here," she replied, almost whispering. Her throat felt tight, her emotions swirling in a whirlwind. Part of her was relieved to hear her eldest son, but another part felt the old hurt he had left when he left. He had abandoned her too, albeit less brutally than Enrique. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I don't even know where to begin. I just found out about Enrique's death a few days ago. I can't imagine what you're going through." Pedro's words were sincere, and this touched Maria in an unexpected way. For a long time, she had imagined Pedro as someone distant, oblivious to the family's pain. But now, his voice carried the weight of guilt and regret. He's gone, Pedro," Maria finally managed to say, her voice choked with the pain that always seemed to be lurking. "My boy." Pedro took a deep breath on the other end of the line. His breathing sounded so close and yet so distant. "I know, Mom, and I know I've been absent for a long time, but now I'm coming back. I was fired from my job. The truth is, things aren't going well for me here either." Maria was silent for a moment, surprised by this revelation. Pedro had always been the son who followed the right path, who achieved success and stability. She never imagined that he was also facing problems. The news of his dismissal caught her off guard, but she noticed something in his voice, a vulnerability he had never let show before. "Pedro, what happened?" Maria asked, still processing the information. "I was unfairly fired," Pedro began, and his voice carried a mixture of frustration and sadness. "A mistake I didn't make. Everything fell apart so quickly and I lost my footing, but that doesn't matter now. The important thing is you. I'm coming back, Mom. I can't leave you alone in this moment." Maria felt a mix of relief and discomfort. Part of her wished Pedro had been there by her side all along, but another part, the one that carried the wounded pride of years of distance and silence, hesitated to accept the help. She had always been strong, always endured everything alone. But now, the little strength she had left was quickly fading. "I don't know if I can do it anymore, Pedro," she admitted, her voice thick with tears that were surfacing. It was the first time she had admitted it out loud, the first sign that her facade of resilience was beginning to crumble. "You don't have to do it alone, Mom," Pedro replied, his tone firm but full of care. "I should have come back a long time ago." Maria, without realizing it, began to cry silently. The tears ran down her face, and she no longer tried to hold them back. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to feel the vulnerability she had been avoiding. Pedro heard his mother's sobs on the other end of the line and remained silent for a moment, respecting the pain she needed to release. "I'm going to help you," Pedro said, breaking the silence. "We're going to get through this together. I'm not asking for permission, Mom. I'm coming home." Those words, spoken with such firmness, were what Maria needed most to hear. The feeling of being completely alone, which had accompanied her since Henrique's death, seemed to begin to dissipate, even if slowly. There was a small spark of hope, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Pedro was coming back. Her eldest son, the one who had always followed his own path, was now returning. "All right, Pedro. I'll wait for you," Maria replied, her voice still trembling, but now with a tone of relief. She knew that the pain wouldn't disappear easily, but the simple idea that she wouldn't have to carry all the burden alone was a small relief amidst the chaos. When the call ended, Maria remained there, sitting at the table, staring at the phone as if expecting it to ring again. Her emotions were still on edge, but now there was something new in her chest. It wasn't just sadness. There was a spark of hope, small but present. And as fragile as it was more than she had had in recent months. Maria knew that the road ahead would be long, full of obstacles and difficulties, but for the first time since the tragedy, she wasn't alone anymore. Maria waited for Pedro with a tight heart. The arrival of her eldest son awakened conflicting feelings in her. Part of her was relieved, anxious to finally have someone with whom to share the burden of pain. But another part, quieter and more bitter, remembered the years of distance, Pedro's absence when she needed support the most. He had distanced himself, leaving behind the roots and his mother to pursue his career in another country. Now, after so long, he was coming back. But would he be the same Pedro who had left? The morning he arrived, Maria found herself standing by the window, watching the street as she waited for the taxi. The sky was cloudy, reflecting the turmoil of emotions inside her. When the car stopped in front of the building, her heart raced. There he was, older, more tired. Pedro's eyes carried a different depth, a sign that he too bore his own burdens. Pedro got out of the car with a simple suitcase and a cautious look. He knew that reunion wouldn't be easy. Even from a distance, he felt the tension between them, the resentment Maria harbored. When their eyes met, there was a moment of silence. That eternal second where everything that had been said and unsaid between mother and son hung in the air. Maria tried to smile, but failed. Her face, marked by recent suffering, couldn't hide the mixture of emotions. "Mom," Pedro finally said, walking towards her. They hugged, but it was a brief, hesitant embrace. Pedro could feel that Maria's body was more fragile than he remembered. The strength she had always had seemed to have been consumed by the recent months of grief and exhaustion. And for a moment, Pedro felt guilty. Guilty for not having been there, for leaving his mother alone for so long. "Are you okay?" he asked, looking into her eyes, but Maria just nodded, not saying much. She wasn't okay, and they both knew it. Inside the small apartment, the atmosphere was heavy. Pedro looked around the space and saw the traces of Henrique's presence everywhere. The clothes he had left scattered in the corners, the empty bottles of alcohol, and a box in the corner of the room, probably containing his brother's last belongings. It was as if Henrique was still there, like a ghost that inhabited every corner of that space. Pedro knew that his mother's grief was deep, but what he didn't expect was to feel his own pain so intensely upon entering that house. The image of Henrique, always full of life, seemed to violently collide with the memory of his death. Pedro also felt the weight of what he had lost, not just his brother, but the years they had gone without really speaking. He hadn't known how to help Henrique from a distance, and now he regretted not having tried harder. They spent the first day together in silence, as if each were wrestling with their own emotions, unsure of where to start talking. Maria made a simple meal, but ate little. The weight of Pedro's presence brought back memories of the past, of a time when she had dreamed of a different future for her children. But life had taken unpredictable and painful paths, and now they were there, reunited more by tragedy than by desire. On the second day, Pedro, trying to lighten the mood, began to talk about his life abroad. He told how the job he had loved so much had turned into a nightmare. A colleague's mistake, for which he had been held responsible, cost him the career he had built with so much effort. The injustice consumed him, and for the first time, Pedro seemed vulnerable in Maria's eyes. He was no longer the confident son who had left years ago. He too was broken. "I feel like a failure," Pedro admitted, his voice low, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "I worked so hard, gave everything I had, and in the end, I was discarded as if I were worthless." Maria looked at him, and for the first time since he arrived, she felt a deeper connection. Pedro was also suffering. He hadn't just come back to help his mother, but also because he needed her, perhaps as much as she needed him. "It's not easy for any of us, Pedro," Maria replied, her voice soft but laden with sadness. "We've all lost something, and maybe it's too late to recover certain things. But you're here now. That's what matters." Pedro nodded, but they both knew there was still much to resolve. The grief over Henrique still hung over them, and the wounds of the past, both between mother and son and between Pedro and his brother, were still open. But that moment, that exchange of confessions and vulnerabilities, was the first step toward healing. That night, Maria felt that although the pain would never completely disappear, Pedro's return offered a new chance, an opportunity for them somehow to rebuild their lives from the wreckage left by the tragedy. The road would be difficult, but at least they wouldn't be alone anymore. In the days that followed, the relationship between Maria and Pedro began to take a different shape. Despite the pain they both carried, the presence of each other provided some comfort. It was as if, even amidst grief and the scars of the past, there was a silent understanding that together they could face whatever came. Pedro spent more time at home, watching his mother slowly resume her routine, though her fatigue was still evident. One afternoon, as they sat at the table after lunch, Pedro looked at Maria's hands, still marked by the hard work in the kitchen. She had returned to the restaurant, but he could see that the weariness was accumulating. Even after everything she had faced, Maria continued to push herself to work, as if there were no other choice. But Pedro knew there was. "Mom, you don't need to keep doing this," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. Maria looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" she asked, a little defensive. Work was the only thing that still gave her some purpose, some reason to get out of bed every day. Pedro leaned back in his chair, reflecting on how to approach what he had been thinking. He knew his mother was stubborn, but he also knew she was exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally. He needed to find a way to show her that there could be another way to live, one that didn't require her to sacrifice what little strength she had left. "What I'm saying is that maybe you could do something different. You don't need to keep working like that, wearing yourself out so much. We can find a new way together," Pedro suggested, trying to maintain a calm and encouraging tone. Maria frowned, as if trying to understand what he was trying to say. For her, working in the restaurant had always been the only way out. There was no room for dreams or projects, only the reality of the need to make a living. "And what do you suggest?" she asked, crossing her arms, more out of curiosity than anything else. Maria couldn't imagine what else she could do besides cook in the restaurant. Pedro took a deep breath, feeling that this was the right moment to talk about his idea. For days, he had been reflecting on what they could do to change their lives. He had seen, during his walks around the neighborhood, how Maria's home cooking and the love she put into her food were appreciated. Maybe there was something bigger they could build from that. "You've always been an amazing cook, Mom. Everyone knows that. And I was thinking, why not open something of your own? A restaurant, maybe. Small at first, but something that's yours, where you can work at your own pace, your own way," he suggested, feeling a wave of anxiety as he waited for her reaction. Maria blinked a few times, surprised by the suggestion. Open a restaurant? At 65 years old? The idea seemed absurd, almost impossible. She had spent her whole life working for others, never thinking of something she could call her own. "Pedro, I don't know, that's too big." "And where would we get the money?" she began, her voice hesitant. "I know it seems big, Mom, but it doesn't have to be. We can start small with something simple. I have some savings, and we can figure out the rest. What you do in the kitchen is special. People recognize that. I know it can work," Pedro said, with a spark in his eyes that Maria hadn't seen in a long time. She looked at him, trying to process the idea. Open her own restaurant? There were so many uncertainties, so many risks, and yet something about the idea awakened a small spark inside her, something she thought had disappeared long ago. Hope. "I don't know if I'm capable, Pedro," Maria admitted, her voice soft. "I'm already so tired. What if it doesn't work?" Pedro reached across the table and took her hand, his eyes steady on hers. "We'll make it work, Mom. It doesn't have to be now, we can take it slow, but I believe in you. And this time, I'm here to help," he said with conviction. Maria looked at her son's hand, holding hers. The idea of not carrying that burden alone for the first time in years was something she had never considered possible. Maybe, with Pedro by her side, it was possible after all. In the following days, the idea began to grow in Maria's mind. She wasn't ready to fully commit, but for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to dream. She and Pedro began discussing possibilities, thinking about locations, talking about how they could secure the initial funding. There was fear, yes, but also a new flame of determination. The weight of the tragedy with Enrique still hung over them, but together, mother and son began to see a new path ahead. The road would be long and full of challenges, but at least now they had something that had once seemed impossible. A new beginning. With the decision to open a restaurant starting to take shape, Maria and Pedro embarked on an uncertain journey, but one full of hope. They knew the road would be difficult, but they were determined to try. Maria, still hesitant, began to trust Pedro's vision, who had studied the local market and was convinced that his mother's talent could be the key to something great. The first steps were more complicated than Pedro imagined. Finding a suitable location, small enough so they wouldn't need much initial capital, but well located to attract the first customers, seemed like an impossible task. They spent weeks visiting places, facing absurd prices, run-down buildings, and endless bureaucracies. One afternoon, after another day of frustrating visits, Maria sat at the kitchen table, rubbing her temples in exhaustion. "Maybe this is a mistake, Pedro," she said, her voice laden with doubt. "I don't know if we have the money, or if I'm ready for something like this. I'm already too old to start a business from scratch." Pedro, who was flipping through some brochures of available locations, looked at his mother with determination. "Mom, I know it seems hard now, but we're just starting. Of course, it's going to be complicated, but you have something that few people have. Talent and passion for cooking. That's the most important thing. We'll figure out the rest," he said, trying to reassure her. Maria sighed, still struggling with her own fears. Pedro was young and full of energy, while she felt exhausted, marked by years of hard work. but at the same time the idea of having something of her own, something that would free her from the need to work for others, was tempting. A few days later, Pedro received a call from a realtor with a new opportunity. There was a small property available, located on a busy street, but it needed renovations. The price was reasonable considering the state of the place. When they went to visit the site, Maria felt a mix of nervousness and excitement. The place was modest, a small building that had once been a warehouse, but it had potential. With some renovations, they could turn that space into something cozy, something that reflected the love and care Maria put into her cooking. The kitchen was small but enough to start, and the dining area, though simple, could be decorated to create a welcoming atmosphere. "What do you think, Mom?" Pedro asked, looking at Maria's face as she studied every detail of the space. She looked around, imagining the possibilities. It could be hers. A place where she wouldn't have to follow anyone's orders, where she could cook in peace and do what she had always loved. "I think it could work," Maria replied, with a timid but genuine smile. And so they began. Pedro used his savings to pay the deposit on the rent and the renovations, while Maria took care of the practical details, the menu, the suppliers, the recipes that would make the restaurant special. It wasn't easy. Every decision seemed like a big step, every obstacle a mountain to climb. There were nights when Maria almost gave up, feeling the weight of her age and responsibility, but Pedro was always by her side, encouraging her to keep going. The renovations began, and slowly the old warehouse was transformed into a cozy restaurant. Maria opted for simple decor, with wooden tables and details that reminded her of her own kitchen. She wanted the customers to feel at home, as if they were sitting at a mother or grandmother's table, waiting for a homemade and delicious meal. However, financial problems began to weigh on them. Pedro's money wasn't infinite, and the bills were piling up. Every new repair to the property seemed to open the door to another expense. The tension between mother and son began to surface. Pedro, as optimistic as he was, knew they were nearing their limit. "Mom, we need to tighten the budget, maybe delay the opening by another month," Pedro suggested, analyzing the numbers. Maria, sitting in a chair in the middle of the unfinished dining area, looked at the unpainted walls and the half-finished kitchen. The dream seemed so close, and yet so far. She knew that the financial pressure was weighing on Pedro, but she also knew they couldn't stop now. "I know, Pedro, but we have to try. If we delay, what we have will end up being swallowed by the bills. We can't wait any longer. We'll open next month, even if I have to work alone in the first few days," Maria said with a firmness that surprised Pedro. He looked at her, realizing that despite the doubts and exhaustion, his mother had found a new strength. Maybe it was the dream of finally having something of her own, or maybe it was the desire to honor Henrique's memory. But Maria was determined. And so, with tight finances and time working against them, mother and son made the final push to open the restaurant. The name they chose was Coração de Mãe, a mother's heart, a tribute to the simplicity and care Maria put into every dish. The idea was to create a space where people could reconnect with their fond memories through food. Deep down, Maria knew that success was still an unknown, but for the first time in a long time, she felt alive. The restaurant wasn't just a chance to make a living, it was an opportunity for a fresh start. Finally, the day of the grand opening arrived. The small restaurant Coração de Mãe was ready after weeks of relentless work. The simple yet charming facade proudly displayed the name that Maria and Pedro had carefully chosen. Inside, the atmosphere was cozy and familiar, just as Maria had envisioned. The wooden tables, simple tablecloths, and personal touches like framed old recipes and family photos gave the place an intimate feel, as if the customers were stepping into Maria's own home. Maria woke up that morning feeling a mixture of nerves and excitement. After so many months of grief, pain, and uncertainty, being on the brink of something new brought a breath of hope. But as much as she was excited, there was also a deep fear. What if no one came? What if the restaurant was a failure? What would they do then? Pedro, who had been by his mother's side every step of the way, tried to cheer her up as they prepared the final details. "It's going to be fine, Mom. People will come. They're going to love your food like always," he said, with an encouraging smile. Despite Pedro's words, Maria's anxiety was palpable. She had faced so many challenges in life, but opening her own business was something new and frightening. She knew they couldn't afford months of failure. The financial reality was still tight, and the restaurant's success in the first few months would be crucial. When the doors finally opened, the first customers began to arrive timidly. They were neighbors and acquaintances, drawn by the new place in the neighborhood and the word of mouth that Pedro had managed to spread with his youthful energy and enthusiasm. Maria, wearing a simple apron and with a focused look, prepared each dish with the utmost dedication. She knew that every meal, every small detail, would be crucial in winning the trust of those first customers. The menu reflected Maria's essence: home-cooked meals, full of flavor and tradition, like those she used to make for her family. Tropero beans, stewed chicken, hearty soups, and freshly baked bread. Simple food, but prepared with the love that only she knew how to put into every dish. The customers who came in could smell the comforting aroma, and many of them smiled when they saw the experienced cook behind the counter, focused and meticulous. "The smell is wonderful, Mrs. Maria," said one of the first customers, an older man who lived on the street behind. She thanked him with a shy smile, still not used to receiving so many direct compliments. But despite the promising movement in the first few hours, sales were slower than Pedro had hoped. At the end of the day, the restaurant wasn't as full as he had imagined, and that left him worried. As they closed the doors that night, Pedro couldn't hide his frustration. "Mom, I know it's just the first day, but we need more customers. We need more people to come and try your food," he commented as he counted the money in the cash register. Maria, tired but satisfied that they had completed the first day of operation, looked at him with a compassionate look. She knew things wouldn't be easy, but she felt that with patience they could succeed. "It's going to take time, Pedro. People need to get to know us. That's how it works. If the food is good, they'll come back, and they'll tell others," Maria said, her voice calm and firm. She believed that. She knew she had given her best in every dish. In the days that followed, the flow of customers remained modest but steady. Maria and Pedro noticed that the customers who came for the first time returned. There was some relief in that. Though few, those who tasted Maria's food seemed to appreciate it enough to recommend the restaurant to others. But financial concerns still loomed over them. The initial profits barely covered the costs, and Pedro knew they needed a significant increase in traffic to keep the restaurant open for more than a few months. Pedro's initial optimism began to give way to anxiety. He avoided sharing his worries with Maria, but she could feel the weight he was carrying. And then, on what seemed like an ordinary afternoon, something unexpected happened. A local food critic, known for his articles in the city's newspaper, appeared at the restaurant. Maria didn't recognize him at first, treating him like any other customer, serving him with the same care and attention. He ordered the simplest dish on the menu, a bean soup accompanied by homemade bread. The man ate in silence, not drawing attention, but at the end of the meal, he discreetly complimented Maria before leaving. "It's hard to find a place where the food has so much heart, Mrs. Maria. I'm going to tell others about this," he said with a smile before leaving. That night, Pedro looked up the critic's name after a quick search, and the tension began to give way to hope. A positive mention in a respected column could change everything. And indeed, the following week, The restaurant Corazon de Mine was mentioned in the newspaper as a hidden gem, highlighting the home-cooked meals and the welcoming atmosphere. It was the push they needed. The days that followed were filled with intense movement. The tables, once timid and empty, were now always full. The restaurant came to life, and the clientele multiplied. Maria and Pedro could hardly believe the success that was finally beginning to appear. The financial worries that had once been a constant began to stabilize. Maria felt for the first time that they were on the right track. The restaurant was more than just a business. It was proof that, even after so many losses, there was the possibility of a new beginning. With the impact of the positive review in the newspaper, the restaurant Corazon de Mine began to attract an increasing number of customers. The small space, which once seemed too large for the modest number of visitors, was now filled with life and lively conversations. Maria could hardly believe the transformation that was happening before her eyes. People came, sat down, enjoyed her food with appreciation, and at the end, warmly thanked her. The success that had once seemed like a distant mirage was now tangible. Pedro, who had always believed in his mother's potential, now saw the restaurant thriving. It had become a reference point in the neighborhood, with people coming from other parts of the city to experience Maria's home-cooked meals, full of love. She didn't just prepare dishes, she served memories, comfort, and, in a way, brought a piece of the past to the table. Every meal seemed to tell a story, but with success, new challenges began to arise. The increase in traffic required more organization, and Pedro found himself immersed in the responsibilities of management. They needed to hire more staff, manage inventory, ensure the quality standard was maintained, and still deal with the growing expectations of the new customers. Pedro, though excited about the growth, also began to feel the pressure of the sudden success. "Mom, we need to think about expanding. Maybe hire another cook or someone to help in the kitchen," Pedro said one afternoon as he looked at the bustling dining area. Maria, always reluctant to delegate her tasks, hesitated. She knew the restaurant was growing, but she was afraid of losing control over what made Corazon de Mine special. Every dish that left that kitchen passed through her hands, and she took pride in the attention and care she put into each one. "I'm not sure, Pedro. I still think I can handle everything for now. I don't want to lose the personal touch," she replied with a tired but determined smile. Pedro looked at her, noticing the exhaustion in his mother's eyes. He knew she was giving it her all, but the restaurant now demanded more than the two of them could offer alone. "I understand, Mom, but believe me, no one's going to take away your special touch. We just need a little help to handle the volume. That way you can focus on what you do best," Pedro argued, with a gentle and caring tone. Maria pondered this. Despite her desire to maintain control, she knew Pedro was right. Success was bringing more demands, and if they wanted to maintain the quality, they would need reinforcements. The next day, they decided to hire a young assistant to help in the kitchen and an additional waiter to handle the service, relieving some of the weight Maria and Pedro had been carrying alone. The restaurant continued to prosper. The news of Maria's heartwarming home-cooked meals spread even further when a famous local influencer posted about her experience at Corazon de Mine on social media. This brought a new wave of curious customers, and suddenly the small restaurant had become a citywide hotspot. It was common to see lines at the door, something Maria had never imagined could happen. However, success also brought some moments of tension. With the intense movement, unforeseen events occurred. On a particularly busy night, Maria realized that an order had been mixed up. A large group of important customers had received the wrong dish, and the kitchen was in chaos, trying to make up for the mistake. Maria, who always prided herself on perfection, felt the weight of that slip-up. For a moment, she thought everything they had worked for could fall apart because of a single mistake. But to her surprise, the customers, though initially dissatisfied, quickly calmed down when they saw the kind way Maria approached them, offering a free dessert as an apology. "Don't worry, Mrs. Maria, it happens, and the food is wonderful as always," said one of the customers, easing the tension that had settled in the restaurant. That episode made Maria realize that, although mistakes were inevitable, what mattered was how they handled them. The restaurant wasn't just about the food, it was about the experience they provided. And part of that experience was the hospitality and care she and Pedro conveyed. The following months cemented the success of Corazón de Mine. The restaurant became known for its family atmosphere, delicious food, and above all, the story of resilience behind it all. Maria, even at her advanced age, had reinvented herself. What had started as a desperate attempt at a fresh start had turned into something bigger than she had ever dreamed of. Pedro, who had initially returned to help his mother, now found renewed purpose in the restaurant. The sense of failure he had felt after losing his job had disappeared. In its place was a deep pride in what they were building together. He felt that in some way everything they had been through, the losses, the pain, the uncertainty, had led to this moment. With the restaurant stabilized and success growing day by day, Pedro and Maria began to talk about the future. They knew there were still many challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, they felt they were back in control of their lives. And more than that, they felt that, together, they could face anything. The restaurant Corazón de Mine wasn't just a place for home-cooked meals. It was a place of healing, of new beginnings, and of celebrating life, even after the greatest losses. For Maria, success wasn't measured just by the lines at the door or the compliments she received, but by the feeling that she had finally found peace, and alongside Pedro, the hope of a future worth living. With the Corazón de Mine restaurant thriving and its popularity growing daily, Maria and Pedro finally began to feel that life was, little by little, stabilizing. What had started as a desperate attempt at a fresh start had turned into something much bigger than either of them had imagined. The restaurant was not just a commercial success, but also a source of emotional renewal for both of them. Sitting at one of the tables late at night, Maria watched the empty dining room after another long day of hard work. The soft lights gently illuminated the wooden tables, and the smell of the last dish still lingered in the air. There was peace there, something she hadn't felt in a long time. The exhaustion was still there, but it was no longer the kind that crushed her soul. It was a good exhaustion, the kind that came after a productive, honest, and rewarding day of work. Pedro approached and sat down next to his mother, sighing deeply. He too was exhausted, but there was a satisfied smile on his face. Together, they had built something beautiful. More than a restaurant, they had rebuilt their relationship, and that, for both of them, was the true achievement. "Have you ever stopped to think about everything we've been through, Mom?" Pedro asked, looking at her with a thoughtful expression. Maria smiled slightly, her eyes filled with memories. "Sometimes, I think it was a dream. Other times, I can't believe we managed to get here. Everything seemed so impossible," Maria replied, as her thoughts drifted back to the previous months, to the tragedy with Enrique, to the deep grief she had felt, and to the uncertainty that had almost paralyzed her. Pedro nodded, his eyes fixed on the floor, as if he too were revisiting the past. Both knew how much they had suffered, and how much Enrique was still present in their lives, even after his tragic departure. The pain of loss would never completely leave them, but the restaurant had given them a new way to deal with that absence. Every meal served, every satisfied customer, was a reminder that, despite everything, life went on. "I think Enrique would be proud of us," Pedro commented, breaking the silence that had followed. Maria looked at him, surprised by the mention of Henrique's name. They rarely spoke of Henrique openly, as if grief was something silent, carried in the looks and pauses between conversations. But now, after everything, it felt right to mention him. After all, Henrique was part of the story that had brought them there. "Yes, I think he would be," Maria said with a sad smile. "He loved food as much as we do. He always asked me to make that stewed chicken that's on the menu. Remember?" Pedro laughed, recalling the times Henrique insisted that their mother prepare his favorite dish, especially on the difficult days. "I think he loved your food more than anything," Pedro joked. Their laughter was sincere but also filled with longing. Talking about Henrique still hurt, but somehow the restaurant had helped them turn that pain into something that didn't destroy them. Now they could remember him with affection, with gratitude for all they had shared, even though the end had been tragic. "Do you think we did enough for him?" Maria asked, lowering her voice, the doubt that still haunted her occasionally resurfacing. Pedro looked at his mother, knowing how much she blamed herself for Henrique's life having taken the path it did. He carried that guilt too, for having distanced himself and not being able to help his brother when he needed it most. But over time, Pedro had learned that there were no easy answers to these questions. "We did what we could, Mom. The truth is, sometimes people get lost. And no matter how much we love them or how much we try to save them, some things are beyond our control. But that doesn't mean we failed. Henrique knew we loved him, and that's what matters," Pedro said, his voice calm but full of conviction. Maria nodded, absorbing her son's words. Maybe he was right. Maybe there was nothing more they could have done. Now, she needed to learn to accept that, to live with the absence, but also with the certainty that Henrique would always be with them in some way. The restaurant Corazón de Maíz had become more than a symbol of a new beginning for Maria and Pedro. It had become a silent tribute to everything they had lost and everything they had managed to rebuild together. The people who came in didn't know the full story behind the place, but somehow they felt the love and dedication present in every detail. As the night wore on, Maria and Pedro stood up to close the restaurant. The physical exhaustion was evident, but both were at peace. When Pedro turned off the lights and locked the door, Maria looked at the sign one last time before heading home. "Tomorrow will be a new day," she murmured to herself, feeling grateful for that. For the first time in a long time, Maria knew that, no matter how difficult the past had been, the future was promising. She and Pedro had survived the grief, the pain, and the uncertainties, and now, with the restaurant thriving and the bond between mother and son strengthened, they were ready for whatever life might bring. Their love, dedication, and resilience had not only transformed their own lives, but also the hearts of all those who passed through the doors of Corazón de Maíz. And that was the heartwarming story of Maria and Pedro, a journey of overcoming, love, and resilience that shows us the power of a fresh start, even in the face of the greatest challenges. If you were moved by this story, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring videos like this. Oh, and activate the bell so you don't miss any new content. Now we want to hear from you. What was the most memorable moment in the story for you? Was it Maria's overcoming after Enrique's loss, or the reunion and reconciliation between her and Pedro? Leave your comment below. We're excited to hear your opinions. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next video.